To discuss Jacob Rees-Mogg. This week he was elected chair of the influential European Research Group, made up of Brexit-backing Conservative backbenchers. And here in the studio we're joined by Andrew Adonis. He's a Labour peer who resigned from his role as a government advisor last month over its Brexit strategy. Welcome to you both, gentlemen. Lord Adonis, you've made your opposition to Brexit very clear. You recently described it as a nationalist spasm that can be stopped. Do you think the EU withdrawal bill, when it comes to the Lords, is the opportunity to stop Brexit?
Well, I agree with Lord Lisvane, who in your clip just then said that this is the biggest decision the country will take since 1945. I absolutely do not think that the Lords can stop it. This is an issue for the people. This started with the people in a referendum, and my view is that the final say should go to the people. The critical issue over the coming months is going to be the relationship between the House of Lords and the House of Commons in seeing that the people have the final say. Now, there's a lot of detail work we need to do on the bill.
When you say the people have the final say, you're talking about a second referendum?
Well, a first referendum on Mrs May's terms of departure from the European Union, not a rerun of the referendum 2 years ago, because, of course, when we had that referendum, we didn't know what those terms were going to be. And just as the people had the first say on whether to start this process, we are a democracy, we engage the people, this is the biggest decision since 1945, and the people should have the final say. Now, I think the Lords may have an important role in seeing that they do have that final say.
Mr Rees-Mogg, you're very confident that we will have a Brexit deal that will look very attractive to most of the electorate, so presumably you wouldn't be too worried about a second referendum on the terms of the deal.
Well, I think the ambition of the Lords in putting forward a second referendum is actually to try to stop Brexit, and Lord Adonis has been very clear about that. He said only yesterday that he wanted to delete all the clauses of the withdrawal bill. We have had a referendum, and we've then had a general election where both main parties backed the referendum result. I think if somebody wants a second referendum, they ought to win an election first, a general election, campaigning for one, rather than getting unelected peers to use it as a stratagem to obstruct Brexit. And it's notable that Lord Adonis and others have not called for second referendums on things like the Scottish vote, and it's highly unlikely they would have wanted a second referendum had their side won.
So, Lord Adonis, you have said that you will make the government's life an absolute misery over the EU withdrawal bill, which does rather sound as though you're using it as a stick to beat a policy you don't like or a decision you don't like, rather than your real role as the Lords, which is legislative scrutiny.
Well, there's a huge amount of scrutiny to do, as Lady Smith said in your film. The powers which ministers are given in this bill is without precedent in a single piece of legislation. They have order-making powers over the whole sphere of legislation that was previously enshrined in European law. So if the House of Lords doesn't pay attention to that, then it's not doing its role as a second chamber. But can I come across to Jacob's remarks just then? Jacob himself has been a supporter of a second referendum. In the House of Commons in 2011, he himself set out the case for a referendum on the terms of departure from the European Union if the electorate voted first time round to set the process in train. So what Jacob is doing is straightforwardly contradictory to his own position. Why?
No.
Because he is an ideologue. He's an ideologue who will stop
You're shaking your head, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
out of the EU.
Yeah, that's simply inaccurate. There was a proposal that there should be a referendum to begin a process of renegotiating our membership, to give the then Prime Minister a mandate to do it, and that he would then come back with what he had achieved, and there would be a referendum on the result. That was short-circuited because the Prime Minister decided to have a straightforward in or out referendum, and the terms were set at the beginning. So Lord Adonis is talking about a speculation, a discussion, before the referendum terms were set. The referendum terms were set. Everyone knew what they were voting for, to leave the European Union. It was clear that meant leaving the single market and leaving the customs union. And I'd put again to Lord Adonis, he would not be calling for a second referendum had Remain won.
What Jacob has just said is completely untrue. We did not know what the terms were when we voted 2 years ago. Indeed, the Conservative manifesto for the election before said that we would stay in the single market. And these are Jacob's words, because let's be accurate about this. These were his words in the House of Commons in 2011. It might make sense to have the second referendum after the renegotiation is completed.
Oh, but he says he's talking about the completely different. He's talking about Cameron's renegotiation that he went to before the EU referendum.
Exactly the same principle applies now.
No.
We've had a negotiation. We're seeing the terms that Mrs May is coming back with, and it's absolutely right that the people should have a say on those terms, and it shouldn't be Jacob Rees-Mogg and the Brexit ideologues who decide what the terms are of our departure from the European Union.
Jacob Rees-Mogg?
The difficulty with this is that people decided in a referendum. The general election manifestos of both parties committed to carrying out the result of that referendum. If Lord Adonis wants to put his case forward, he should try and stand for election, something I don't believe he has ever done. See if he can win a general election campaigning to reverse the result. What should not happen is that unelected peers should try to frustrate the will of the British people as now expressed in 2 democratic votes.
OK, so on that, Jacob Rees-Mogg, you've been issuing some veiled threats this week saying that the House of Lords would get into difficulties if they try to frustrate Brexit. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think what Baroness Smith is saying is actually very sensible, that the House of Lords will abide by the constitutional conventions, that it will look to revise. I have concerns about some of the Henry VIII powers myself, so I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing for the Lords to look at in its normal constitutional role. But if the House of Lords gets into a 1909 position of peers against the people, then the people win, and the Lords need to be aware of that. They need to observe the constitutional norms, and then everything will carry on as it is.
The Lords need to be aware that what might happen to them in those circumstances, that the government could flood the chamber with 200 new Tory peers?
Well, it's already pretty flooded, but yes, you would have to have a deluge on top of a flood. The House of Lords has to abide by the constitutional norms, otherwise the Prime Minister would be perfectly entitled to use the reserve powers to create more peers. But I hope that won't be necessary. This, again, is a conditional. It's not something that I'm calling for.
Lord O'Donnell?
What Jacob is doing is threatening the Lords. He's a Brexit ideologue who will stop at nothing to get Brexit through without the people having the final say. But what he's also doing is dodging the issue, because nobody is talking about the House of Lords asserting itself against the people. The issue which it will come down to is if the House of Lords invites the House of Commons, that is Jacob and his colleagues, themselves to reach a decision again on the issue of whether there should be a referendum on the final terms. That is not anti-democratic. That is the proper expression of democracy and the role of the House of Lords. As I say, that is something which Jacob himself has supported in the past. It's no longer convenient for him to recognise that fact, but I'm afraid people's past does catch up with them. His ally Nigel Farage has now come to support a referendum on Mrs May's Brexit deal because he realised it's inevitable. My own view is that in the coming months, as people realise the gravity of this decision and the fact that Parliament itself is not in a great place to take it because there has been a referendum, I think the case for a referendum on Mrs May's terms will be unstoppable, and the House of Lords will play an important democratic role in inviting the House of Commons to reach a decision on that.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, it would be ironic, wouldn't it, if the British Constitution, working its way through as it does, the House of Lords making revisions, sending them back to the Commons, for you to argue against that when what you wanted was us to take back control of our own government?
I'm all in favour of taking back control and decisions being made in the House of Commons with the Lords acting as a revising chamber. But you have to understand the motives of people who want this second referendum. They are trying to obstruct Brexit. Lord Adonis compared the decision to leave as big a mistake as appeasement in the 1930s. There is deep-seated, almost hysterical opposition to the Brexit decision by the Remainers, and they are using this as a stratagem to frustrate Brexit. But what they should do is not use the unelected Lords, but they should campaign in a general election if they've got the courage to do it, which the Labour Party notably didn't in 2017, to call for a second referendum and a reversal of the result. But they don't have the courage to do that because they know the British people aren't with them.
OK, let me ask you one slightly different thing, Jacob Rees-Mogg, before we finish. Are you excited that the Bayeux Tapestry is coming to Britain? You don't think this is maybe a bit cheeky of the French to be sending to us something that celebrates a Norman victory over the English?
Well, I think it's absolutely great. I think it's a splendid gesture, and I'm sure many people will want to go to visit it. And we could send them in return a fragment of the Union Jack from Nelson's ship at Trafalgar, which was sold last week, as a reminder that, by and large, we win the battles.
Any idea what we could send them in return for the Bayeux Tapestry?
Well, some people have suggested we should send Jacob in return, but the problem is the Bayeux Tapestry is much more recent in its views than Jacob for the most part. However, on this big issue of Brexit, the crucial thing is that the people should have the final say.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much for that. And you can find more Brexit analysis and explanation on the BBC's website at bbc.co.uk/Brexit. It's coming up to 11:40 and you're watching The Sunday Politics.